So I had an idea, don't know if it'll work because lighting in here sucks. I'm in my kitchen. Unfortunately, that puts me right near the hallway where the neighbors are, so my reading might be screwed up. But I read on YouNow some of my book, and it's snowing outside. I thought an audiobook could be cool. I'm only going to be doing a few chapters at a time because it's winter and I cough in winter. So you can hear what it's done, but I can at least get a few chapters in before somebody outside goes crazy or the cat drives me nuts or whatever. So we can at least get through some of this. Prologue. Kaya no longer remembered its name. It was ancient, but the oracles had sworn to remember for it. They listened to its stories, whether memories or fanciful tales, no one knew anymore. They tended its gardens and nurtured the crystals that sky folk thought to be magic. Oracles were vital to Kaya's survival, thus they were vital to the survival of everyone below. But the council did not know the truth. They thought the oracles, to whom the crystals spoke exclusively, believed themselves to be above their station. They did not know why the crystals would not speak to them. They also could not comprehend why the oracles restricted their actions so tightly within the wall. What harm could come from a hearth? Why must their food be cooked outside the walls? When asked about a particular restriction, an oracle would simply say that the crystals would fail if they allowed it. It was the truth, of course. You see, an oracle could not tell a single falsehood. If anything disturbed the delicate network of crystals, or the ground upon which they grew, all would fade and eventually shatter. The crystals that adorned the houses required replacing every few years for that very reason. Elder Danath thought of these things on her 300th birthday. Her wide, almond-shaped eyes flickered deepest obsidian in the azure scales of her lined face. Her tattered wings twitched restlessly with her thoughts. Her tail, adorned with heavy gold circlets, dragged wearily along the floor as she paced. Her mate, Elder Pyres, watched her agitated movements with characteristic stoicism. She was always the steadier of the two, though Danath was the more decisive. Danath did not understand why Pyres was so quiet. She knew what today was. Today they would join with Kaya. Their bodies would be interred within its central chamber, forever one with the great Tantalus. The oracles would have access to their memories for centuries to come, Kaya willing. In other words, today, the day of her birth, was also the day of her death. It was always so from the time of their landing. Each elder, indeed every crystalborn that gave its life to Kaya, viewed this day differently. Pyres was a decade younger, which often gave Danath twinges of guilt, but she never begrudged her mate a mere 11 years. What is that but a drop in the well of years, she would say philosophically. Danath envied her ideology even as she cursed it. After all, because they were a mated pair today, they would die on the same day. A knock at the door rooted Danath to the soft floor of their private apartment. It was Pyres who called for the person on the other side to enter. All the eunuch said was, "It is time." Inside, Danath railed at Kaya for asking such a high price for her service. Outwardly she was calm as she followed the nameless servant out of the elder quarters. Pyres glided soundlessly behind her, her presence the only thing keeping Danath from bolting for the dubious freedom of the wild zone. Down through the wall they went, elegantly attired as though for a gala, claws tapping the stone stairs toward the cliffs. The narrow ledge curved around the gray mountainside until they reached the point. Waves crashed ominously below them. Here they were each handed a goblet by the pale, stone-faced eunuch. They knew what it was, but it was their duty to drink of it. Quite romantically, they twined their arms before drinking... the tablet did something. Before drinking deeply of the dark blue liquid. Danath glared at the cliff face one last time, and then they fell in two brightly colored heaps at the eunuch's feet. They were ready to join Kaya. Chapter 1. Life went on in Tantalus Cavern, sometimes called Crystal Song Cavern by the Sky Folk. Everyone heard the crystals humming. Most knew what it meant. The elders were gone, and a new one must be chosen. Those who were not of crystal-born descent knew that they would never achieve that rank, so they plodded onward. Those who were looked to one another in speculation. Most often a true-blood crystal-born was chosen. Rarely a half-blood would sit on the crystal throne. The captain of the Sovereign Guard patrolled the city inside the wall, for she had no authority outside it. Besides, there were no crystals outside the wall that could choose a new elder. She was on the lookout for that personage as she strode the length and breadth of the cavern. There were no streets per se, aside from the wide thoroughfare from the gate to the elders' quarters. She skirted houses, storefronts, and temples, watching the people she passed. Her eyes skipped over elves, gnomes, humans, and the like. They would not be chosen. She stopped to help a farmer right his fallen sled, the only mode of transportation allowed in the cavern on this side of the wall. "Are you all right? Is the sled low on power, or did it tip over?" The farmer waved away her concerns. "I'm fine, and so's the sled. Might have put the goods on a bit off balance is all. Finicky things, these sleds. They go where you tell 'em to, and that's grand. But they can be a touch wobbly." She smiled at the little man. Dwarf, she'd guess. "Yes, they can. Down here one never knows how magic will work, eh?" The farmer harumphed. "Wouldn't know. My kind don't usually mess around with magic. But since it's a magic-y sled or nothing, you take what you can get, yeah?" "Right you are," she said. One end of the greens that had fallen from the cart vanished, but the farmer didn't notice. The captain just smiled and continued on her way. She had the misfortune of running into Crack Greywing, bishop of the Sky Temple, near the gate. The cranky old avian always rubbed her the wrong way, though she couldn't pinpoint why. "Yeah, greetings, Gardly Isha. How goes the search?" His beady little eyes bored into hers, beak clacking anxiously. She tilted away from him as subtly as she could. The incense his temple used always made her eyes water. "It is Captain Laisha, Bishop. If we must use your proper title, so must you use ours." Her disdain was barely contained. Fortunately, the bishop never made the effort to understand her or her people, so it went unremarked. "Yeah, of course. Deepest apologies, Captain Laisha. How goes the search?" She let the mispronunciation slip. Perhaps he could not wrap his bird-like tongue around crystal-born names. "I am certain that the new elder will be found," she said confidently. "Yes, yeah, of course they will, lad." He patted her shoulder with one gnarled, clawed hand and shuffled away. His beaded wings rattled with every slow, laborious step. "But not without that signet ring, I think," the old man cackled to himself. "No, you will search in vain, little man. There will be no new elder, and the council will rule in their stead." He had to fight the urge to dance in the streets. The high and mighty elders were gone, and without the ring of power, a new one could not rise up to challenge the council. "Now to get those silly term limits removed," he thought. "Only then will my plan be complete. Decades I have waited, but it will be worth it. There is no avian on the council, indeed, none in the cavern save me. They will think me unbiased, perfect to lead those feather brains." The bishop had done unscrupulous things in his quest for power. He could not kill by his god's decree, but he'd done worse. When his own people cast him out, he could have hidden underground. Instead, he'd chosen to rule the underground. A low cackle bounced hollowly off the nearest crystal. He'd already won, they just didn't know it yet. Chapter 2. Eilish was on official business, or so she told herself. There were rumors that the council wanted to cease these searches for oracles. The council was not entirely crystal-born. The foolish skyfolk did not know how vital oracles were. All they saw were the restrictions they placed on life within the wall. If they dislike it so much, why don't they move their fancy houses outside the wall, she thought acidly. Or better yet, go back to the skies they worship. She kicked a pebble, but not hard enough to strike the wall. She had great respect for Kaya, and even a single pebble might upset it. Within the wall, balance was everything. She knew this. Other crystal-born knew this. Even the deep elves and sky elves understood. Of course the Fae understood. The gnomes, dwarves, humans, catkin, halflings, and Myriad other races too few to merit seats on the council chafed at the restrictions. They complained endlessly about things like food never being hot when it reached their tables. The Fey folk simply ate raw foods, or made stews in heavy cauldrons that retained heat adequately. They baked bread. They used magic to heat their food. Fey folk were nothing if not resourceful. The deep dwarves simply lived out in the wild zone where they had near autonomy. After all, they were there before even the Crystalborn arrived. By and large, they left the Tantalus cavern folk alone. The younger races were too impatient and spoiled, in her opinion. We didn't even have to let them inside the wall to begin with, she thought, perhaps a bit spitefully. Elish was only 18, with precisely 282 years ahead of her to mature. She took advantage of her youth at every chance, acting on impulses that she would ignore as she became old and boring. She was certain of it because her mother was 83 and quite stuffy. She was on her third spouse as of next week, and all but one were cavern folk. She righted a lopsided crystal, wondering what her mother saw in sky folk. She paused, claws tapping the crystal thoughtfully, pondering the mysteries of adult life. That was when the crystal decided her fate. An electric shock sizzled up her arm and across her shoulders before sparking down her tail. She tried to remove her hand, but it was fused to the crystal. Bright light seared her eyes. She threw her other arm over her eyes, but the light burned from the inside out. She screamed, as you'd expect. People came running, also as expected. Fortunately, one of the first responders was an oracle, and he knew what to do. "Back!" he bellowed. His large forearms flexed against the crowd of well-meaning, concerned people. "If you touch that girl, you will kill her!" he roared. That stopped them in their tracks. It wasn't the words alone, but the blazing yellow eyes. They did not make the half-orc, half-crystalborn more intimidating to the motley crowd, as an outsider would presume. No, those glowing eyes marked him an oracle, and everyone knew that they could not tell a falsehood of any kind. If he said she would die if they interfered, they believed him. The monk at the edge of the crowd watched avidly. He had heard tales of what he was seeing, but to actually witness it was rarer than a dozen eclipses. The poor girl's back arched in obvious agony, but not a soul moved to aid her. Then a most peculiar thing happened. The scaly skin beneath her tunic rippled, rose in twin peaks between her shoulder blades. With a deceptively quiet snick, the fabric tore open enough to reveal two tiny, presumably vestigial, wings. The crowd gasped. The girl dropped into the waiting arms of the oracle. He did not lunge for her until her clawed fingers slipped nervelessly from the smooth surface of the crystal. Only then did he dare make contact. The humming, which the monk had only just identified as the crystal itself, ceased the instant her scaly palm parted from its sharp perfection. The crowd shifted restlessly about the pair on the ground, unwilling even now to touch the girl. It was obviously safe now, for the oracle had touched her, but the wings marked her as untouchable for an entirely different reason. Elish, only 18 years old, was their new elder. Chapter 3, and the last one I'm going to read. Grom tucked the small, as yet fragile wings against his broad chest before picking up the wilted crystal-born child. "Nay, she's a woman now, like it or not," he thought with a touch of sadness. He knew well the gaze thrust upon her, and he did not envy it. Not for 1,000 marks would he trade places with this slip of girl. The crowd parted before the hulking oracle, in reverence rather than fear. He marveled for perhaps the thousandth time that it was so. Tantalus Cavern was far different from above. There he would be feared and reviled because of his orc lineage, half or whole. Here, because he heard the words of the crystals, he was treated with respect. His mother, full orc though she was, had their respect by proxy. The tall, lithe body was lighter than one would expect. What she represented made her a heavy burden indeed. He felt many eyes upon them as he carried her up the wide causeway toward the elder quarters. They were met by one of the house eunuchs. Since his former patrons had joined Kaya that very morning, and one of his brethren was even now preparing their bodies for interment, he was expecting them. One would never know how long he'd been waiting, for the eunuchs were patient unto death. One long arm gestured onward, before disappearing once more. He walked ahead of the taller man, all arms folded within his sleeves, much like an ascetic monk. His bald mahogany head was the only skin that showed, being swathed from neck to knee in dark, heavy muslin. Grom was not intimidated by his silence. Not much intimidated man, who was well over 7 feet tall and covered in blue-gray scales. His plantigrade, clawed feet were bare by necessity, and his tail was shorter and thicker than a full-blooded crystalborn. His horns were shorter than a true-blood as well, but far more menacing. His eyes were smaller than a crystalborn, larger than an orc's. A thin brown ring around his wide pupils meant that should the need arise, he could walk above without going blind. This was a valuable trait in the caverns, for no one knew when the great collapse would occur. The dark, silent man waved him into an oddly shaped room with a large bed atop a low mound to one side of the chamber. He lay the girl on it, taking utmost care with her fragile wings. The last oracle to deliver their elder was not so careful, so she was never able to fly. Grom would not have it said generations later that he was so careless with his elder. He turned to leave, but a chair was firmly set behind him. He sighed with resignation, and lowered his considerable bulk into the backless, spiral-legged contraption so common here. They said that it distributed one's weight more evenly, but it looked far too fragile to hold him. He always sat carefully, afraid that this time it would shatter. The floor was soft, but he did not fancy looking the fool before his new elder. As always, the chair stood firm. The eunuch remained in the room, a shadow in the corner. He understood, of course. Oracle or not, he was still a male around her age, or so he presumed. He was never good at judging the ages of true-blood crystalborn, though he could determine their genders correctly. Most skyfolk could not easily discern their genders, and often assumed one way or the other. Though only half-blooded, Grom strongly suspected that it was not so binary. He'd met couples that skyfolk assumed to be male and female, but were actually both the same gender, yet one was able to give birth. In fact, his cousin Geralt was the product of a same-sex couple. Sure, outsiders could claim they'd used the brood palace to acquire children, but that was only because they had not seen a pregnant male before. Simply because he appeared to be female, they assumed him to be. Just like they assumed that Aunt Murray is a man, he thought wryly. His lip curled briefly before strict discipline smoothed his features without thought. Looking at the very feminine lass in the very large bed, he thought irreverently that no one would mistake her for a male. He tried very hard not to think about why the bed was so large. He pictured goblins, minotaurs, elves, anything that he found unattractive. He examined the strange, elaborately decorated room minutely. At length the girl woke. Large onyx eyes blinked rapidly. She sat rather abruptly, and he could not stop himself from reaching to steady her. The eunuch twitched with the same impulse, but Grom was closer. What happened? Grom glanced at the eunuch, but as he'd expected, the man did not speak. Perhaps he could not speak. My lady elder, you have been awakened. The words chimed throughout every oracle's mind at the first joining. You have awakened. He wasn't sure if those words were meant for elders as well, but there was no one here to tell him otherwise. If there had been a crystal nearby to consult, he would have. It seemed disrespectful to ask the one that chose her, and the ones in her new chambers were too small to be much help. Elder? Me? She squeaked, thoroughly undignified. But I'm only 18, she yelped. Just as I thought. Only 2 years younger than me. He knew, however, that some crystalborn resisted maturity for decades due to their longer lifespans. To anyone's knowledge, he was the first orc crystalborn hybrid, so no one could say how long he would live. He took a rather long viewpoint because of that. Nevertheless, my lady, you have been chosen. Perhaps the crystals require longer terms of service, he offered helpfully. He'd been a child when he was awakened, so this was not unusual in his mind. She was old enough to be considered an adult in most cultures. Only the elves, with the longest lifespan of all known mortal races, delayed adulthood until the age of 60. The girl, whose name he still did not know, scooted toward the foot of the bed and began to pace. A sad smile ghosted across the eunuch's face, though neither of the young people noticed. "Might I ask your name?" he asked, with the deference that her position afforded. Her wide eyes flicked his way once, then darted away. She did not reply for a long time, but his profession required the utmost patience. He waited, clawed fingers resting palm down on his legs. She stalked the length of the room many times before throwing her name at him like a dart. Eilish Maniera. Maniera was the surname of her mother's last spouse, and since she was now undoubtedly an adult, she would not take the name of her mother's latest one. That was just as well, for her mother's new surname was to be Sharn. She wasn't fond of the deep elf her mother was marrying, either. The hulking brute brought her back to the present by greeting her by name with a surprisingly low situ. His forehead and knee very nearly touched the fuzzy floor of wherever she was. The other leg swung back into the side effortlessly. His wrists did brush the textured surface, which required great skill to achieve without cracking against the ground. She was reluctantly impressed by this giant of a man. Not many were taller than she, nor more graceful, but this mountain of scales seemed to be just that. "And what might I call you?" she asked, reluctantly. She wasn't sure he wanted to know anything about this highly disturbing individual. He wasn't aggressive, as his appearance suggested, but something about him unsettled her. He rose from his position of subservience and looked her in the eye. He would never dare in public, but everything was strange to her just now. A bit of humanity was warranted, this once, he thought. "The name is Grom, milady, Grom of Darkwash, though the place of my mother's kin wouldn't mean much to you. My sire's surname was Kindrith, if you would prefer to use it. Otherwise, just Grom will do." His little speech over, he knelt on the floor at her feet. It was not something she'd ever witnessed, which left her at a disadvantage. She didn't like the feeling. In the customs of his mother's people, he was showing his station in life quite literally. His status was lower than hers, so he knelt before her to lower his height. "Oh, for Kaya's sake, would you get up? I cannot see your eyes, and that unnerves me." Grom stood with the simple grace of a tiger and waited. She had earned a modicum of respect from him for insisting that his eyes be visible. It is wise to see what lay in the hearts of one's subjects, and the eyes were said to be the window to the core of a person. Eilish decided that her discomfort had nothing to do with his physical prowess. It was his utter stillness that bothered her. He did everything with an economy of movement, and then he just stopped and waited for her to do something. She didn't know what he expected, nor could she tell if he was displeased with what he saw with those quiet eyes. If she had been around more oracles, she might have noticed that it was an inherent trait. Perhaps it was learned from sitting still and silent while they communicated with the crystals, or perhaps they were chosen because of their inner stillness. No one really knew. When he said nothing more, she began to pace again. This time, however, she ranted about whatever popped into her head. He and her personal eunuch would learn that this was her way of processing new things. It gave the older man a strange sense of peace to see that not everything changed. "I don't see what I was chosen. I'm still figuring out who I am, and Kaya wants me in charge of everything?" She didn't pause for replies to her questions, which was just as well. One could not answer, and the other was content to let her vent her frustrations. "My mother's getting married again. The council's trying to phase out the search for new oracles." This was news to Grom, but a slight widening of his eyes was the only sign of his surprise. "And for all we know, you lot are the only warning system we have. Why, oh why, can't people see sense?" The more agitated she got, the brighter her eyes became. She railed against the council in general, the specific councillors who opposed oracle rulings, and even the uncle who kept her apprised of the council's dealings. She thought he ought to be more firm with the dissenters. The eunuch's arms uncrossed, even leaving their sleeves in his shock. Grom openly stared at their new elder. Still, she paced and ranted, unaware that her eyes fired brightest crimson. At last, Grom risked touching her. It was just a graze of her sleeve as she passed, for it was all he dared, but she reacted as though he'd struck her. She whirled to face him, scarlet eyes blazing. "Don't touch me," she snarled. His hand immediately retreated, but he pointed to an ornate hand mirror on her dressing table. What, is my hair awry? I don't care. He neatly nabbed it without a single thread of his clothes touching hers and held it before her. She gasped, took the mirror with trembling hands. What does this mean? Were you wrong? Am I an oracle, not the elder? He gently lifted the mirror until she could see her wings, touching nothing but the silvered glass. But I thought, oracles are never elders, are they? Grom was gravely serious even for him. There is a legend of an elder oracle, but for all of our sakes, I hope that it has not come to pass. I think you must speak with the crystals, milady. Only then will you receive clarity. She let out a puff of air that sounded suspiciously close to a growl. Fine, how do I do that? I will begin again with Chapter 4, when my voice is rested.